Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, it is post-election. The numbers are now more or less firmed up. The Liberals are 3 seats short of a majority, and that's going to be interesting going forward. But I figured I'd just take a few minutes to talk about a few of the observations I made over the course of the last 24 hours or so. And just to get a sense of where I think some of the shifting landscape is happening. As we talked about with Supriya last week, this was a weird election, and it really played out that way over the course of the results. And so those are some of the things I just wanted to have a brief conversation about, at least. I'm going to be writing more about this in columns over the next couple of weeks, probably. But these are my initial observations from where I sit. So first one is the fact that the NDP absolutely cratered in Ontario was really interesting. Yes, the party was in trouble, but they had some pretty safe seats, particularly in southwestern Ontario, because that's where a lot of their blue-collar union base has tended to be, especially in the auto sector areas, and that is gone. And that was really interesting because it's showing how the dynamic has been changing with this particular voter base. They almost entirely went conservative, which is really interesting and makes me wonder about what kind of messaging that the two parties have been giving and why that's had a change in reception from that particular base. Some of it, I think, does have to do with the NDP very much going into this urban progressive kind of mode, which has to do a lot with the way in which they have basically tried to become a branch plant of the Bernie Sanders and AOC wing of the Democrats in the US, and just shaping everything in their messaging to fit that particular mold because that's what gets them traction online. And that lost part of their connection to that base that they had. And I think that that's interesting to really kind of explore because that's going to have a lot of repercussions for how the party rebuilds itself going forward and what they want to end up being. And I don't think it's just about the notion about, do we want to be the conscience of Parliament or do we want to govern? You actually have to have a vision if you want to govern and not just be the conscience. And this is what I think part of what their problem is. That's part of what the Ontario NDP's problem was in the provincial election, was that they didn't have a vision to articulate to voters. And this is part of the underlying problem that they need to really think long and hard about. The other thing that's really interesting about the collapse of the NDP vote in Ontario is that provincially the party has gained a lot of strength west of Ontario, at the provincial level, in part because in those 4 provinces, they have crowded out the Liberals as a political party on the provincial side. So you have a lot more two-party races in those provinces as a result. And that's changing up, again, how the NDP is perceived and how their organizational strength works in those provinces. And so the NDP seats that were saved were Winnipeg Centre, Edmonton, Strathcona, and then a couple in Vancouver. And I think that there is something to the notion that when the party's organizational strength on the provincial side has become dominated westward, that may wind up being where the party finds a new base. And I think that's interesting, but it's also, I'm not sure how to put this, because the Liberals don't have as much organizational strength in some of those areas, but they do, to an extent, because they borrow it from certain progressive conservatives and also the NDP provincially when it comes around time for federal elections and politics. So again, this is something that there's a dynamic happening here that I think is gonna reflect on the NDP nationally, and so I think that's gonna be something interesting to keep an eye out. But again, because the NDP's collapse was just such a main driver for what happened during this election, I think these are things that we need to kind of think about as we're going forward in this post-election period. Turning to the Conservatives, I think it's also interesting that they weren't able to make the kinds of breakthroughs they were in the parts of Ontario where they needed to, particularly in the suburban GTA. They did pick up a few seats here and there, which essentially cost the Liberals the majority, but it wasn't enough for them to get a pathway to victory. And I think that that's something that they need to really think about in terms of how they're messaging, particularly, I mean, this is the key to a lot of those writings is suburban moms. And because the Conservatives continue to be essentially hostile to women in electoral terms, that's something that is really kind of just played out once again in this election. And I think that that's one of those key dynamics that they have to think about as they get to their next a stage in development, I guess. The other thing that was really noted was that the kind of voter coalition that they built has changed, particularly in this election. I mean, it was a lot more angry young men, but a lot more of the kinds of grievance tourists that made up a big part of the convoy occupation that we saw downtown in Ottawa, and so on. These largely rural voters, which again, rural voters have been a mainstay of the Conservatives, but this is a slightly different composition of them. And I think that the fact that they have alienated boomers, who you would think would be one of their prime cohorts, is something that's really interesting and really something that we should be thinking about in terms of how the dynamics have changed. Because you would think that that's their particular like prime demographic, but it's not, or it wasn't in this case. And they've alienated a lot of the kind of red Tories, but people who kind of grew up in this sort of center-right environment, and had a political home there. And Poilievre in particular has distanced himself from that voter base in order to attract a more angry populist cohort. And I think that's interesting to see how that's kind of played out. And that's another one of those dynamics that I think is really something to think about in terms of how this election played out in the way that it did. And it also makes one wonder about how sustainable the voter coalition is when you are looking for angry young people and grievance tourists. So I think that's also a question that they need to ask themselves going forward. The next step is going to be, of course, Poilievre needs to find a new seat. But before he does that, will he survive his first caucus meeting back, essentially? There's all this talk about if they agree to adopt the Reform Act, which, yes, is complete garbage legislation. And you have heard my rants on this before, but this is the mechanism that they use to push Aaron O'Toole out after his loss. Which, I mean, if you think of it in that particular term, you're also overlooking the behavior that Aaron O'Toole exhibited post-election, where he was basically being imperious with the party and trying to silence or absolutely eject people who were asking questions of him and trying to find some level of accountability for his election loss. And that wound up in him just alienating the caucus writ large, and they got rid of him as a result. So does Pierre Poilievre do that in the weeks ahead? We'll see. Does the caucus feel that he was the liability, that it was less the message, because they did increase their seats, they increased their voter share, but he personally, as a personal brand, was a drag on the party in many areas. So do they decide that they need a new face for what they're doing, or what? That's something that they need to figure out. So if he does survive any of the knives coming for him in the next few weeks, he will need to find a new seat to run in. And, generally they try and find the safest seat possible for the leader. But sometimes that doesn't always work. A few years ago in Ontario, John Tory was the leader of the PC party, ran in the provincial election, lost his seat he was running in. And then the party found him an absolutely safe seat outside of the city, or outside of Toronto, and something that, they had not lost this seat in decades. John Tory runs there in a by-election and loses because the locals said, why do we want a parachute candidate from outside? The local guy, who is, I believe, a Liberal, won. And John Tory's provincial political career was finished. He went on to become mayor of Toronto until he had an affair and had to resign. But these kinds of things do happen in politics. And so that is the danger that Poilievre finds himself in. In the meantime, there's also the question about whether he can actually stay in Stornoway, because that is the official residence is for the leader of the opposition. You need to have a seat to be leader of the opposition, as opposed to simply party leader. And he does not have a seat, so he may have to vacate Stornoway unless he can come to some kind of agreement with whoever the leader in the House is going to be in his stead, whether that's, the House leader or whomever. Or if they term it a parliamentary leader, as has become the practice for parties who don't have a leader with a seat, which is another one of those real problems with the way in which our system has been devolving. But that is a tale for another day. But again, that's something that we're going to have to find out in the next few weeks. And so he may have to move out, at least on a temporary basis, because it could be 6, 7, possibly on the outside 8 months before that by-election happens, depending on how magnanimous Mark Carney is in scheduling it at a convenient time for Poilievre. So we'll see there. And then the last point I just wanted to bring up was that Bruce Fanjoy's win in Carleton over Poilievre in that seat is an object lesson. And that lesson is that there is really no such thing as a safe seat. Everyone likes to think that there are always safe seats, but this is the demonstration that if you put in the work at the grassroots level, you can flip a safe seat. And Fanjoy worked that riding for more than 2 years. It's a huge riding. We need to remember that. And he worked those doors day in and day out for more than 2 years and built up a voter base in what was considered a blue dog riding, meaning that you could paint a dog blue and they would get elected as a conservative. It's been considered that for a while. I do think that there was some demographic shift in Fanjoy's favor, both in terms of some of the redistribution. Also, after COVID, a lot of people, particularly public servants from further in town in Ottawa, had moved out there because telework has become more of the norm. And so they had moved further out into that area. You also have young families moving further out because it's less expensive to find housing out there. So that possibly worked in his favor a little bit, but it's again one of those things where he worked those doors for 2 years at least. And that is a lesson in grassroots politics. This is why we need to ensure that the grassroots are strong and nurtured, and that people at that level can feel heard and participate. And he had people coming out who have never participated in a campaign before and worked the riding with him because yes, you had a bunch of people who really wanted to see Poilievre go on, particularly even though he'd held that seat for 20 or close to 20 years. But because there was a sense that, yes, you could change a safe seat, and they did it. And so hopefully this is a lesson to others in this country that no seat is actually safe if you're willing to put in the work. And maybe we will see some flips in other ridings in future elections because they've taken this example. So we'll see. Those are some of my observations. Less than 24 hours from this whole thing going down. Yeah, we'll leave it there for now. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at Journo_Dale on Twitter and JournoDale no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.